Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming along today. If I can just very briefly introduce myself. My name's Eamon Salmon. I'm the Chief Executive of the Football Medical Association. I think in a nutshell, to understand what we are, is to think of the PFA, who look after the players, and the LMA, of course, the League Managers Association, who look after the managers. Well, the FMA effectively are in the same position as those institutions, and we look after the medical and science staff in professional football. I have a very good panel with us today, so I'm going to introduce on the far side Chris Barnes. Chris is a consultant sports scientist who's been in and around football for the past 20 years. He's worked at West Brom, at Newcastle, at Middlesbrough. Chris has also worked with the Great Britain basketball team and England Rugby League. Chris is a board member of the FMA and very well respected within the field of sports science. So we're very interested to hear his views today on the kind of risk of injury and the impact on players and teams. Sitting alongside Chris, we have Grant Downey, Grant is OBE, which kind of says a lot about his input into the game. Grant is currently Head of Performance at Manchester City Academy, but has also worked previously at Glasgow Rangers and worked for many years with Middlesbrough as head of their department, and has also worked with the FA very closely as well. News to me, Paul Williamson. Paul is the lead physiotherapist at the Perform Centre at St George's Park, which most of you will know hosts the England set-up in the England camp. Paul is a former international athlete himself, but as a physiotherapist he's currently supporting the PFA's residential rehabilitation scheme at St George's Park, and of course is also heavily involved with the care of the England and FA national teams based at St George's Park. So I thought we'd start off today and I would just throw a couple of questions in, but this is very much a questions and answer session, so we're really more looking for questions from yourselves. We have a great experience here over many years, so I'm sure the panel will be able to give you their insight into risk injury and management and prevention of injury. But I wanted to start off with the first one, but please do put your hand up and throw the questions in, because it's about what you would like to ask rather than what I would ask. And my first question to the panel, and I'll start with Chris on the far side, is it possible to reduce the incidence of injuries in football? Chris, is it possible?
Is that a yes/no question? First of all, the business that we're involved in isn't about reducing injuries, it's about mitigating risk. And I think if the question is about mitigation of risk, then yes, we can have an impact and can have an effect. But that is dependent upon so many factors, and this might sound like a little bit of a cop-out answer, so please bear with me. That is dependent upon so many factors. In my view, the biggest factor that will impact on the risk of injury within a professional soccer club is the culture that is established there, so the relationships between different departments, the relationships between scientists, medics and the coaches, and the players as well. One thing that I am absolutely convinced of is, I'm not saying coaches cause injuries, but injuries follow coaches. So certain injury patterns will follow, not so much the individual, but the individual's philosophies and the way in which they do actually undergo training. I don't know if you guys would agree with me, or whether that's something that you feel a little bit differently about. But injury patterns do definitely follow coaches. And if you can kind of pick up on that sort of the DNA in terms of how coaches structure their training, perhaps then we can actually get underneath it and begin to impact on those risk factors associated with that specific approach.
Okay, interesting.
I think just to sort of back up what Chris has just said, I think you've got to work out, first of all, is it your primary role as a medic or a sports science in football to reduce the rate of injuries? And I would say it's not. It's to try and support a team win your league or the Champions League, whichever club you're working for. And by the way, along the way, you'll pick up some injuries. And yes, you want to reduce that rate if possible, but ultimately, you ain't going to win anything without getting some injuries. The slight concern I have for medicine and science in sport, as Chris was saying, if we get too hell-bent on just reducing injuries, potentially we're stopping players perform. So therefore, for all the staff that I work with, they are called performance staff who treat injuries. There's a difference. We are there to try and help young players achieve their dreams who will get injured on a journey. So we expect it. Yes, we want to reduce the risk factor, but ultimately, I would suggest if you speak to any ex-professional player who's probably played 500 games, he's probably paid 50 pain-free. 450 will have had pain in some part of his body. There's a danger with medicine and science. It's trying to take away all those factors, and it shouldn't. You've got to have pain in parts of your body. To train hard, you'll get adaptive soreness. There's a danger if we oversell this factor of reducing injuries. Minimizing risk is exactly what we should be looking for, and that can be individual to the player. And as Chris rightfully said, I've worked under certain managers where you could manage players differently to others, hence injury rates were greater or less. They accept that at times. They accept the risk, and if they accept the risk and the player does, you as the medic and sports science are part of that team, potentially taking that risk. It is your job to outline that risk to the player, manager, and probably most importantly, to either the managing director or the chief executive, so they know the risk their asset is being put under. So therefore it is a team decision on the management, and that's ultimately how you can, I feel, reduce injury risks.
Yeah. Paul, what's your thoughts on that?
I think I come from a different perspective from these guys. I'm not under a club, so I don't have the same pressures that these guys face on a day-to-day basis. We see the fallout on the residential rehab scheme of players that are already injured. Hence, it's difficult to put that into context for prevention. Yeah. What I do think is important, and rightly so, these guys said, is about working as a team. Yeah. and working as a performance team. As a former athlete myself, it was all about performance and less about looking at what injury risks you potentially had. But you certainly need to look at minimising those. Working with your strength and conditioning coach, your sports scientist, your medical team. An interdisciplinary approach is probably the best way that you're going to look at minimising injuries. Looking at your individual players, screening them, finding out their intimate details that you can tweak and change without diminishing any kind of performance. I think that's probably the key. It's certainly easier for us to do that with no pressure of getting a player back to play early, pushing them on too soon. That's something that these guys obviously have to face, and that they've got different challenges from me.
I'm interested in your thoughts as an athlete, a former athlete, in that if you were picking up injuries in your training program, would you automatically, as an athlete, turn to the medical and science staff and look for answers? Would you kind of say to them, why am I picking up so many injuries, and is it your training schedule that you're giving me, or would you look to them as the first point of contact in trying to prevent and reduce the amount of injuries you're sustaining?
From personal experience, as a former athlete, no. That was day to day, that was part of it. I'd get on niggles, you cope with niggles and you push on, and then you pretty much hope for the best. I broke down, and I've learned a big lesson from that, and I've had some severe injuries and come back from it. Working on the other side as a medical practitioner, players that we see tend to shy away from seeing the medical staff. They hide. I had one yesterday from one of the guys that I'm supporting. He'd held an injury back for 4 to 5 weeks until it got to the point where he couldn't continue. There's pressures on the players. They don't want to be cut out of a team. They want to make their career. Yeah. So I think it's important that you build that relationship with your players as well, so they can come to you for that advice.
Right. It becomes interesting then that the answer to that question about reducing the incidence of injuries is about the team ethos, about everybody at the club working together, the management, the medical staff, the science staff, the players, everybody being integrated in a cohesive unit.
And I think that goes a stage further, because again, with the audience that's here today, one of the main responsibilities are on the people who buy players, because you often buy the risk. Because if you buy a player who's had a previous, one of the biggest predictors of future injury is previous injury. So if you're in a position that you're about to spend £10 million on a player and give him a 5-year contract, and he spent the last 3 years on the treatment table, it's highly likely to spend it on the treatment table for the next 3 years. So do your due diligence. This is where medicine and science probably could have a great impact, is into the potential looking at the risk before they even come to your club in the first place, rather than this so-called 2-hour medical, which actually will give you very little information, and you find out the player's already signed anyway. Yeah. So why does it happen?
I think Grant lives in a different world to the ones that I've lived in the last 20 years. So Man City, they've got deeper pockets than the other football clubs that, that I've worked at. Generally speaking, at the senior end, I suppose what they're able to bring on board is somebody whose flaws or whose risk of breakdown or injury is an awful lot less than some of the players that we've seen come through the doors, certainly at Middlesbrough and West Brom when I've been there. They certainly carry increased level of risk. They are flawed physically, normally, certainly from a clinical perspective. And I don't know how you feel about this, but psychologically, a lot of them really do carry an awful lot of baggage as well. Hence, the money that you're paying for these people is much lower. The risk that goes with them is actually much greater. And you might actually argue that the need for a large science and medicine team is actually that much greater in the lower league teams than it perhaps is in the teams like Man City, Man United and co.
Yeah, yeah. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions on that they would like to raise? Sure. I think. Sorry, just 1 second. I think there's a microphone there.
Hi there. Sorry, you called out previous injury as a strong indicator of likely to be injured in the future. I'm just wondering what other things you might seek to measure to assess
Before you sign them?
Well, ongoing and beforehand.
Well, I think, again, yes, definitely once you've signed them, you're wanting to undertake a sort of a monitoring program, and that will go from, obviously, the amount of times they play. Because, again, there is a danger, again, if you take science to the extreme, you might, for example, do MRI scans of knees, ankles and hips. You don't expect, if a 28-year-old player comes with a clean bill of health, I'd also be very concerned too, because they've never played. So it's actually understanding the science and applying the art form. But again, I would track them from games played, but also, before they come in, I'd want to know a lot about them previously. And again, I think we live in a world we can find out about players because social media is so apt. I think you should track players on that. You find a lot about a person's character. There'll probably someone somewhere will know a little bit about them. And I think Chris tapped on the area that is absolutely vital. Is that player going to fit not only into your team ethos, is he going to fit in with the players in that dressing room? Because both Chris and I have been involved in some great dressing rooms. However, you can suddenly bring one player in it who can disturb the balance. And I almost call it's the sum of unequal parts makes a team. They're all uniquely individual, but that player's chemistry and physicality can completely change a dressing room and affect others and actually cause injury. And I've got no science to back that up, but I've seen it because it suddenly creates pressure on situations and coaches. So I think it's tracking a lot of information, but the information is only information. It's who then interprets it and how you use it. And I know Chris and I were both involved in a previous club where the chief executive was very clever that way, because he would actually use some of the information we give him to reduce the transfer fees and players' wages, and then dependent on the number of games they got played. So he was very bright, and that was because the club had 50p to go £5. But he was very good at that and deserved a lot of compliments for the way he managed it.
I think just to, just to broaden out on what Grant's talking about in terms of individual risk as well. There are clear periods of the year where the collective risk increases. So we've got a crazy situation in football in England where the period of time where the players do the most work is after the period after they've possibly had their 4 or 5 weeks off. So they'll come in for the first couple of weeks of pre-season, and it still seems to be the prevailing philosophy that that's when we need to get them fit. We need to work them and graft them. And invariably that's when you suffer your highest number of injuries. There are other periods of time which increase the overall risk as well. So a new coach bringing in a new philosophy exposes everybody to increased risk. The bodies have become accustomed to whoever's been in charge before, and all of a sudden they will be being asked to train in a different way, at a different intensity because of a new coach. So that period of time increases the risk. The third one, which is more of an individual kind of risk, is when you take on board a new player. So I've seen it countless times, and I'm sure you guys have as well, where you'll be at a club and a new player will be signed and the manager or the head coach is desperate to get their hands on him, as are the rest of his team. So this guy will be straight into full training sessions, and then every assistant coach will want to show what they can do and bring their bit to the party, so they'll be kept back for extras after training. And hey presto, they break down after 4 or 5 weeks.
Mm.
So there's some really, really simple things, I believe, that could be done to actually reduce the collective risk and actually give us a chance of keeping these players where they should be, which is on the training field.
But one of the things that hasn't been mentioned yet is the position in the league. And of course, a winning team seems to have very, very few injuries, and a team that's struggling suddenly seems to have lots of injuries. Do you find that there's a pattern there as well? That a struggling side will have players that go missing, or?
Well, one of the things that we've seen, obviously Prozone are the company that have tracked Premier League games for so many years. And okay, again, the teams that I've been associated with don't win as many games as the teams that Grant's currently associated with. But what you do notice is, if you get a team that does go 2 or more goals up early on in a game, the amount of work that's performed later in that game to sustain the result is actually significantly less. Now, your better teams will be boxing off games much earlier and actually having to go through an awful lot less work.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the teams that I've been working with, a 90-minute game is a 90-minute game, and invariably, if you're chasing a game or losing, in fact, you're asking greater questions of your players than perhaps you would be if they're in the upper echelons of the league.
Right. Okay.
So, totally agree with you. When you're winning games, you don't seem to suffer injuries.
That's right. Is there any further questions? I take this.
Hi. Considering the fact that injuries have a very high impact on the livelihood of players, I'm just thinking back about probably, I think it was the World Cup in France or Germany when Ronaldo, there was a huge media frenzy about the fact that he was injured, but they were actually forcing him to play. If a national team, for example, knowingly puts a player on the field who's injured, can a player in their personal capacity actually sue the national team or the club, especially when it comes to players of that?
I would say none of us are lawyers here, so it'd be difficult to answer that with any, and we're not. So it'd be. I think the only thing we can say is, at the end of the day, the players consent to play, and it's a player's right to say yes or no. So ultimately, I have never in my life forced a player to play, and I've never actually seen a manager force a player to play. They've tried to persuade them regularly, but they've never forced them. No one's ever said you must play. So ultimately, there's a person who's got the biggest responsibility to their own health, is the individual, and so I would suggest that's an individual choice.
I think it's a great question if we did have a lawyer here. None of us are qualified to answer the question directly. Ultimately, if you were to go to a Premier League game on a Saturday, out of the 22 players that roll out on the field, I would argue that 5 or 6 will have a certain degree of raised or of elevated risk attached to them actually starting the game. Our job isn't to pick a team. Our job, quite simply, is to provide information that enables managers or coaches to make more informed decisions. So if we have a situation where the risk of injury with a player is elevated, of course we would alert the coach to that situation. Most of the time the coach is desperate for us to make a decision, don't get me wrong. His job is to pick the team, his job is to make the decision. Normally, when faced with that situation, unless it is a do or die game, the coach will probably make the decision that the player doesn't play for the player and for the medics. If it is a situation where it is your cup final or such an important game of the season, then people will take risks.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, we mention the word all the time. It is a game of risk, and the risks are higher in certain circumstances. And unfortunately, I think we've got to live with that.
Yeah. I think was there another question at the back there?
Thank you. I've got a more sort of product-based question. Do the reinforced pitches, such as Deso or Fibrelastic, and the softer sort of slipper style football boots increase or decrease injury risk?
I think, from my angle, I think anything that's a change will always cause a risk until you get used to playing on it. So it's a bit like when you look at AstroTurfs against grass. If you continue to play on AstroTurf, you don't get any more injuries than if you continue to play on grass. The problem is when you keep mixing them. I probably get a little bit more disturbed as a medical angle, because I've seen a couple of injuries caused recently by where pitches end almost on the touchline and then there's suddenly AstroTurf. That doesn't make any sense to me because you're going from one surface to the next. So it's those deceleration forces. I've also seen a lot of modern pitches almost have a camber off the side, literally off the sideline. Players have to be able to slow down. So again, the people who design those, to me, don't take a lot of maybe thought from a medical angle, you know, or maybe it's a cost, I don't know. But I think one surface against the other, you just see different patterns. The modern boot, as you say, has changed absolutely out of all proportion. And again, I think it comes down to the individual's own biomechanics and looking at a foot. But again, some players will sign deals based on money rather than what's good for their biomechanics. And therefore, you know, I've had instances in the past that it's difficult for players to change because they've got a 5-year deal with X company. It's not that their boot's wrong, it's their biomechanics are wrong. So it's not to say there's a bad boot out there, it's maybe the individual to them.
I think that's a really good question, particularly in the context of the way that pre-season operates currently within football. So most of your Premier League clubs nowadays will head off either to the Far East, where typically the pitches are very, very poor, or to the United States, where quite often they'll be expected to play full 90-minute games on an AstroTurf pitch, when they wouldn't put their players anywhere near AstroTurf while they're back home in their own training ground. I think absolutely, as Grant says, I think players can adapt and get used, and they could adapt and get used to training on AstroTurf over time. But it would have to be a slow process, and then most players would actually be quite comfortable on that particular surface. The problem comes with this business of change. So if they play on a Deso pitch one week and then they come back and train on natural grass, or if they're required to go and play on an AstroTurf just on a one-off occasion, that's when you start red flagging players and the risk of injury actually goes through the roof. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, especially when you're looking at load compromised athletes. A very quick change in surface is not the best, and I guess that's down to the medical teams and the sports science, strength and conditioning to manage the load of all your players and make sure that what they're doing on an individual basis is appropriate, really. So.
Yeah. I'll just throw, sorry, go ahead, yeah. It's just coming down.
Hi, so what role does or can technology play in risk mitigation? So, for example, wearable technology, heart rate monitors, or speed, for example?
Every Premier League club now uses these tracking technologies to record pretty much every step that players take. If I can just kind of give an example, I suppose, from the last club I was at, where I think we quite effectively use the technology. And what we did was we looked at 3 years' worth of training data and mapped it against our injury profile over that 3 years. So there's about 10,000 training days, player training days that we looked at. And we were able to create a model that linked exactly what players do in training to the relative risk of injury. We don't get many injuries in football, so the relative risk is always going to be pretty small. But we were able to create sweet spots for training. So a couple of days before a game, for example, we knew that if we went between 45% and 51% of a game, that was our sweet spot in terms of the volume of work that players would do. And we had a similar sweet spot for how hard they worked, for the intensity. So we were able to sort of prescribe the volume and the intensity of the training. Coaches prescribed the drills that actually precipitate that. So the technology was able to help us in that respect. I don't know if that goes some way towards addressing that. Grant?
I think it's, again, the technology has been fantastic at giving us information. What we've got to make sure that information, first of all, is really accurate performance. Once it does, as Chris says, that way, it's brilliant to use, but it's only information again. And it's how you use it. So it's fantastic, but you've got to learn how to use it. The danger is most managers rightfully don't have time to look at a big spreadsheet. So it's up to us to create the headline that's going to catch them. So if you start going around with spreadsheets to managers, just shut the door. You've got no, and rightfully so, they're busy people. But it's up to us to, I think, to come in with the headline, ultimately, which will give them a better performance and help them win the league. And if you do that, use technology.
I think it's only right and proper as well to say, and I'm probably in the wrong environment to go shouting about this, but there are an awful lot of quack technologies out there that will promise you all sorts in terms of risk reduction. And I hope that within the clubs, when these people do come knocking at the door, there's people with an element of common sense to appraise just what they're actually going to get if they do engage with a number of these technologies.
So why is it then that with the increased investment in medicine and science over the past 15, 20 years, and the number of staff and everything, and the investment in this side of it, why is it in general terms that the amount of time lost to injury hasn't changed?
Because we're not any better at it than we were. We're just more complicated. So you'll have science and medicine departments in professional football teams now that, I started 20 years ago, and I think I was probably about the first sports scientist to go into football, so a kind of a one-man operation. And I'm not saying I was particularly good because I didn't have a clue what I was doing at the time. Nowadays, you'll have a department of 15 or 20 people, and it goes back to what we said at the outset. In those 15 or 20 people are only actually going to be in any way effective if there's a degree of cohesion and communication. The sport is a mock with egos at the moment. It's not the players, as Grant said earlier. It's actually the staff that are around there supposedly supporting the players. It's not about the players anymore. It's actually about them on a lot of occasions. And that's kind of me having a rant, I suppose. But we have a real issue at the moment in terms of roles, responsibilities, and what people do. And until we resolve that, then we can invest as much money as we like, but the injury rates won't.
Well, I think that flags up the FMA, because one of our part of our ethos really is to actually bring the community spirit back together between the medical and science staff. You know, many years ago, with only 2 or 3 staff at the club, you tended to know everybody at the other clubs. You could get on the phone to them and chat to them and find out who they refer people to, etc. But with the expansion in the numbers, you've also got diversity and you've also got separation. So part of our ethos has been to really recreate this network, this community spirit amongst all our members, the doctors, physio, sports scientists equally. And that is a challenge, and I'll say that. But in some clubs it works fantastic. They are really integrated as teams. And in some clubs you almost get the impression that some departments aren't really speaking to the other departments. And it's because there's a little bit of grey areas in some of the roles. And sometimes people feel that that's our remit, not yours. And other times it's the opposite way around. So maybe we're going to be pivotal in... So let's do an analysis on, once we've set up this and got everything going, let's see if the injury rates reduce.
I think one to say this is where technology has been very useful, because if you look at the research, and if you take the Premier League 10 years ago now to where it is now, the physical demands are completely different. So therefore that's where technology has been very useful. We can quantify that and say the amount of sprinting that players do is doubled. The amount of distance they're covering, if anything, is slightly less. But it's much more of an athletic, explosive sport. So therefore, the game has moved on. So what you did 10 years ago has got very little relevance for today from a conditioning angle. So again, that's one aspect of that. And as Chris rightfully said, I was just speaking just literally last week to the South African Springboks team doctor, who says he's got 22 support staff now, and 15 years ago he had 7. He had a far better cohesive unit, and it was easy to manage with 7 than 22.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
I was just going to ask you, so the number of sprints have gone up, the game's faster, everything's moving along. What are your thoughts, particularly in your club, about your strength and conditioning coaches? It's something I'm very keen on. I'm a big believer in that, and I feel we're maybe perhaps in the lower clubs, the strength and conditioning coaches, out and out strength and conditioning coaches, are lacking, and the players aren't physically capable of meeting the demands that are placed against them.
What we've been able to do over a number of years is put a consistent physical methodology in for the way we not only play the game but how we condition the players. So therefore the players will go through a curriculum that takes them from the age of 9 to 21 on a development pathway that takes that into account. But also there's something that we've not considered, and we have considered it, if that makes sense. So I've told you the game's changed in the last 10 years. Our 9-year-old will not be playing the game to the 22. So what's he going to look like then? So that's what we are considering, but I'm not going to share with you, because hopefully that's our IP. So, but therefore, we have to think beyond what it looks like now.
Okay. Could I just take a question from...
Yeah, sorry. I'd just be interested to see what the panel thinks, going back to what Chris said about egos, about the treatment of Eva Carniero and that whole saga. And does that kind of prove, given Chelsea's recent form, that they've maybe not reading too much into it, the importance of stability in the medical staff around the team and around the players?
Well, we would, as an association, we would argue that, and clearly, you know, the ethos for many companies is that better together, and the teamwork is imperative, and it's just as important in a football club. So from our point of view, stability, even in management, and stability within the medical teams is of paramount importance.
I think it's, you know, I could safely say I've sat down and, should we say, professionally disagreed with a lot of managers, but it's always been behind a closed door, and I respect their opinion, they've respected mine, and you go and do it. I mean, and I think you do it that way. That's the way business should be done, and it should be challenged, and it's great to be challenged. That's what we're there for. But, you know, I wouldn't comment on another club, the way they do things. That's their right, you know. But it's important that people do challenge what we do. It's how you challenge is the key.
Yeah, yeah. So there's another question just behind you there.
Gents, I used to play football, played for about 18 years as a professional and semi-professional, but lower leagues. And obviously listening to what you're saying about at the top level, I mean, I'm a coach now and I work for a Category 3 club, so when we played Category 2 clubs, they've got more staff than players, but we don't have that luxury. In terms of the lower leagues, is there a I would say there is a responsibility, but what, in your opinion, needs to happen lower down in terms of, I mean, I've played with managers who are the one-stop shop because the budget doesn't give them the facility to employ the sorts of people that you're talking about who should be working together to be able to manage the players, not just technically and tactically, but psychologically, which you touched on, and definitely physically. So whose responsibility is it? Do you think there's a responsibility from the Premier League clubs to filter down the knowledge, because we haven't seen a great degree of players from Premier League clubs going down to lower league clubs to get experience? Is there a reason why? Is it because clubs aren't confident that they can facilitate the environment that's at the Premier League club, and so they end up going abroad for experience? I mean, is there a responsibility, in your opinion? Whose responsibility is it? Clubs, you know, at the end of the day, clubs want to look after themselves, and that's business, because, you know, it is a business. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how, if you feel there should be assistance given, because even doing the coaching badges, which I've done, I mean, I'm not a sports scientist, but I know if I go into a lower league club, I'm going to have to manage that area. Yeah. Even though I don't have the knowledge. Now, I'm going to have to get it from somewhere, but I can't employ someone full-time to do it. Yes, there's interns and things, but it doesn't quite recreate what the top level are trying to achieve. And then is that maybe one of the reasons why there's such a big divide from the lower leagues up to the top level? And we seem to be losing a lot of homegrown players. I mean, I'm from Ireland, but English players, is that a direct result of this? And
I think,
is that taking its toll on the national team as well?
I think you're right.
They've obviously gone down in their level, I think, in everyone's opinion.
I think you're right in that when we talk about football generally, we are always focusing on the Premier League and the top clubs. And really, there's got to be a thought process that takes us down to these grassroots level, even within the professional league. And I've visited so many clubs at that level, and you wouldn't believe the facilities they are working under. It's actually quite embarrassing. Whose responsibility is it to ensure that we get down and reach those levels with funding and the necessary criteria that they need to improve their situations?
You're right. I mean, at the end of the day, you live according to your means, and sports science and good sports medicine is lower down the agenda for the lower league clubs than perhaps good coaching. Yeah. So I don't know whose responsibility it is, but certainly what I would like to see is there's an awful lot of people out there with a lot of experience, and even just to set up some kind of a mentoring scheme whereby the young people who are working within the lower league clubs do have a point of contact. Somebody can come in and cast an independent eye across and hopefully in a friendly and supportive way help and advise what, generally speaking, in the lower leagues will be a relatively recent graduate from university to try and get the best from whatever resources they have available. So I don't know whose responsibility that is, but my idea, and I've given quite a bit of thought to this, so thanks for the question. My idea would be that we were able to set something up whereby independents do come in and almost mentor the people that are operating full-time in those environments. Yeah,
I'd agree with Chris. I think there's a bit of a responsibility on everyone, really. I think there's a responsibility to the leagues, but the clubs, but also you as an individual. Because at the end of the day, there's 101 ways to learn. You can go on the internet to learn, but as Chris said, I think one of the problems with small clubs is it tries to, rightfully, it's got not many pennies to spend. But I think there are people that small clubs could bring in 1 day a week, even half day a week, of an expert's time, probably for that staff and that education program, could be beneficial. So I think it's a matter of trying to look at different ways. But I think, as I say, I think the responsibility is shared.
I think it's something that we're already doing. So working on the PFA scheme, we see a lot of these guys that come from the lower league clubs and they have no medical support, no sports science. And when they do, we certainly try and help them and invite them up, and they come and spend time with us, with their players, if they can spare that time, and then they can learn from us while we're working. That seems to be quite a nice way of doing it, and we certainly report on all the players and speak to the clubs at the end of every week for every player that we see and give them feedback. So I think we're already doing that in a very small way, but it certainly needs to be on a bigger scale to help these guys out, because these are the clubs that are getting the injury crisis, and a lot of players are getting injured through lack of medical support and sports science. So
I think ultimately the responsibility might be ours as the FMA, which is why we've set ourselves up to highlight these issues to the PFA, to the Premier League, to the Football League, to the LMA. And if we can get at that table with them and highlight these issues, then and ultimately it comes down to funding. At some point somebody has to allocate some funds to provide these kind of services that we know are needed as medical practitioners and science practitioners. So I think ultimately it would fall on us, and this is what we're striving towards. Is there any other further questions?
Could I ask the panel, please, their view on the growing use of cryotherapy in Premier League clubs for the recovery of fatigue or recovery from injury?
I don't have any experience of using it yet. Yes, we will be looking into it, and I think you look at anything that may give you a competitive advantage, but not having seen it, for long enough yet. But again, speaking to other people who have found its benefits, there are benefits. But again, into the environment I work in, time will tell. But certainly we will look at anything that could give us an advantage.
Yeah, Chris?
I think the one thing that has been shown, cryotherapy is a broad term, so I assume you're referring to these chambers at minus 130 degrees. Whereas my preferred approach to cryotherapy would actually to sit people in a cool, not an ice bath, but in a cool bath for a prolonged period of time. And that's simply because that's where I've seen the most compelling evidence from the people who are performing research in that. And that's not to say that chambers at minus 130 degrees maybe can't be helpful, but until the research in that particular domain catches up with the research in terms of cool baths, then that would be my preferred mode. It's a little bit cheaper for the people at the lower league clubs, and it's easier to carry out as well.
Yeah. Paul, do you have any thoughts finally?
Yeah, no, we've done a little bit of research looking at that, mainly on the cold water immersion, and we're certainly keen on using it post-injury, but not so much post-conditioning. There is some blunting effects which are going to reduce chemical release that are going to have a sort of growth promotion. So
I think that draws us to a close. You'll all agree we could go on for another hour at least with some of these questions and the experts we've got. So thanks everybody for coming. We do have a stand just down here, and I'm sure the three panellists will be with us for a coffee and a chat, and I'm here today and tomorrow as well. So if anyone would like to come down to the stand, we'd be glad to speak to you there. Thanks very much.